In this video, you'll learn about the new sliders in Lumenzia version 7. The purpose of these sliders is to give you an easier way to either adjust your mask previews or to adjust your mask properties after they've been created. For example, if I go and click on Lights 3, we get these orange preview layers, and I could go in and tweak any of these levels, curves, or black and white adjustment here to get a different effect. If you're on CS6, you're going to have to keep doing that because the sliders are a CC-only feature due to technical limitations of CS6. But even if you're a CC user, it's still good to understand how these work, to understand the basic concepts, and there's going to be times when the slider is not going to adjust exactly what you want. The slider is just going to adjust one of these things in one dimension for you. It's just going to look at the most commonly needed adjustment and give you an easier way to do it. For example, if I slide down here, I'll get an adjustment of the curve here. So I'm moving in this lights family all the way from lights 1 at the top down to a light 7 adjustment towards the bottom is the max I can get there. So with that, I'm getting a change in the curve, but I could still go and adjust the levels if I want to. I could still go and adjust the black and white. In fact, the black and white might be a great way to look at different tones in the image. So it's still good to understand how these preview layers work. Just know that with this slider, you get a tremendous degree of control here with just one slide, and you can hold it down and move it continuously. If for any reason you're seeing jerky performance because your machine's a little bit slower, you may want to just click to position, or you can't even type these values in. We can go in here and just type in something like 3 to go to the third level, and it moves right to that point. So you have a lot of different ways to interact with this. Also, if you have your tool tips on in the panel, let's go and turn these on. You have this option for tool tips on sliders. If the tooltip is getting in the way of your use of that slider, you can disable just these slider tooltips here, or you can turn off all tooltips if you want here as well. So just know that that's an option if you're seeing any performance issue with the sliders. So that's the general idea, but now let's talk a little bit of specifics. So you can see I'm moving within the lights family when I've started with a lights mask. In general, wherever you start your preview is going to determine how these sliders behave. If I'm in the midtones column, I get the same thing. It's going to make a curved adjustment within this midtone family from midtones 1 through 7. Same thing with the darks, going from darks 1 through 7. Again, 7 not available as a button, but you can now slide down to a zone 7 or a dark 7 down in the bottom here. So all three of these columns are very similar. The dark and light midtones, though, are different. If I click on DM1 or LM1 here and slide down, I don't jump down to light midtone 2. So this column is not making a change in the curve. It's actually making a change in the levels. And the number you see here is the black value on the left-hand side of the level. So as I move up, you can see the number 30 and 30 here. It's moving this black slider out. I can bring this down. And the general idea here, this vertical slider is known as the precision slider. So even though the mechanism changes depending on which preview you're on, the general concept is the same. The more you slide down, the more you precisely focus on whatever it is you're trying to select. So if I'm trying to select highlights, L1 is the most general possible value. That's why it's at the top here. Whereas something like lights 5 1/4 is much more specific to just the brightest things in the image. So I'm getting more precise as I move down and more general as I move up. So it's just changing that focus in the overall selection. Let's take a look at the zones here. Both the wide and narrow zones have general principles that are the same. If I click on zone 5, I now see both sliders are lit. So I have more degrees of adjustability here. What's going to happen with both of them is it's going to adjust the curve for you. Now, if you're not familiar with how these curves work in Lumenzia in the preview layers, it's important to understand that the X value here is the image brightness or the tone in the image. So for example, a mid-tone mask of zone 5 is looking at the center value, which is right here. The Y value is how selected it is. So if I want a zone 5 mask, it is most selected in the middle of the range of tones. And that's exactly what we see here. Now, if I slide down, it's going to be more precisely focused on just zone 5. So it's eliminating more of these adjacent values. Whereas if I go in the opposite direction, it's more generously including the neighbors around it. So it's getting more precise down or less precise going up. Let's go and bring this in just to focus things a little bit. Now, if I slide left and right, this horizontal slider is known as the value slider. Sliding to the right will give me lighter tones. You can see that the whole curve is shifting right. I can slide all the way over here. You can see I've moved from a zone 5 to now I'm in a zone 7 preview. I can slide all the way left and I move from a zone 5 to a zone 3 on the left here. So notice that this horizontal slide, it's not meant to give you the full range all the way from 0 to 10. And the reason for that is so that you can make more precise adjustments. If I go and move this slider just a little bit here, I get a nice controlled adjustment in this curve. Whereas if this slider represented all the way from 0 to 10, that curve would have jumped much more. So restricting the amount of movement is important in making this slider more precise. And it assumes that you got relatively close. You should be able to look at the image and know you're somewhere between zone 3 and 7. That is somewhere in the middle range of tones, and start there. If for some reason you don't get there, let's say you get all the way down to zone 3 and it's just not dark enough, well, you can click on zone 3 to recenter in zone 3 and then just keep going left. That's going to get you all the way down to zone 1. So you need to get somewhat in the vicinity of your horizontal or your value adjustment here. If you're using the pickers, same level of control. Let's click on a wide picker and we'll just pick something off the side of this cab, click OK. And let's take a look at our curves, and you can see that it's centered around this tone, but I can still move it to the right or move it to the left with the value slider, and I can make it more precise sliding down or less precise sliding up. So whether you're using the pickers or the zones, you get the same type of control in this situation. Range is going to be a similar thing. If I click on range, let's go and pick a darker tone, say OK. Let's go pick a lighter tone, say OK, and we'll look at the curves here. Same concept. If I slide to the right, I move the entire curve to the right. If I slide to the left, I move the entire curve to the left. Now, if I move down, I get more precisely focused on the tones around which I selected. So my original range has shrunk, and if I slide up, I'm going to be more expansive, include more additional tones. So similar level of control in range as the zones. It's just that you have kind of two peaking values instead of one. The last mask to look at are going to be the vibrance saturation difference. If we click on vibrance or saturation, the difference is in the curve here. And the way that the curves work for vibrance and saturation is that the x-axis is how saturated you are from no saturation on the left to 100% saturation on the right. And the y-axis is black in the mask to white in the mask. So naturally, a saturation mask looks at highly saturated pixels and makes them highly selected in the mask. If you want to get more precise to just the saturated values, naturally as we slide down, we're going to see this curve eliminating more of these middle saturated values until we get to the point where we're mostly just selecting highly saturated things in the image. Whereas a vibrance curve is the opposite effect. It's selecting things that don't have saturation, and the more precise we get, the more that we only include the things that are not saturated. If we look at the difference curves, of course, there is the difference plus and minus version here. If we don't use a smart object and just hit lighter, we'll see that we have one slider value. And this slider is going to give us an adjustment in the levels here. And in this case, it's moving the white point on this, but it's still going to go from less, particular to being more precise as we slide down here by adjusting essentially the steepness of the mask. Now, we only got the one adjustment because we have normal pixel layers. Let's destroy this and instead start over using a smart object. The advantage using the smart object is that the radius of comparison has been applied to the smart object, and you can adjust it manually by clicking into it, or now you can use the slider. So right now, as we slide to the right, we get a larger radius of comparison. So we're looking at more of the neighboring pixels, how they compare, sliding this to right. If you've been paying attention carefully, you notice that the vertical slider sometimes shows a numeric value and sometimes it doesn't. The horizontal slider is not necessarily showing a value, but if they're not shown here, they are shown temporarily as you're clicking and holding. So if I click and hold here, you see this 100. If I move to the left, you're seeing a lower value. The reason for that is to give you just some way of being able to click and make very small adjustments if you need to make a comparison. But in general, I've sort of hidden the numbers because in most cases, they don't really make sense. There's not an easy place to put them. So in this case, it's actually the radius. If we look at the radius that's being applied here, we're at 31 pixels, and that's what I have when I click here. If I go to the right, I get 81 there, and I should see, well, I guess I left it at 79 when I let go. But that's what this is telling us here versus this 100, 160 here. This is off of the levels adjustment. You don't necessarily need to really think about what these numbers are. The reason that they're available in most cases is more so that you can click and hold and just understand how fine of a change you're making, so you can be a little more precise. If 180 wasn't right, then you might look for the next value of 175, because this slider right now moves and jumps a 5. So that's how the precision and value sliders work for the orange preview layers. Let's clear that and take a look at how they work for existing masks. So if I click M for my marquee tool, let's just draw a little rectangle. Let's click on a curve and we'll just say a not feathered layer mask, click OK, and make an adjustment in this just so we can see what's going on here. I'm going to make a pretty strong adjustment just so you can see what's happening. So of course we have this unfeathered mask. It's just a hard rectangle in the image. If we grab this slider, it's going to feather that mask, or we can take a look at the mask and you see this adjustment here. So as we move down, you get more precise, less feathered. As you move up, you get more general, less precise, more feathered moving up. And you can see numerically from 1,000 pixel radius on the feather all the way down to no feather at all. So it makes it very quick and easy to adjust that feather. Of course, we could just double click on this and we'd have our feather adjustment here, which we can move. So it's doing the same thing, it's just giving us an easier way to access that particular adjustment. You need to notice that these sliders stay synced in this particular case. Now let's go ahead and delete that layer mask. And I could have instead, let's click our marquee again. This time we'll click on mask. This time we'll make a vector mask, not feathered again, click OK. And we'll see this. Now we also see no feather. And as we slide up, we'll notice that the output is changing. So with vector mask, you always see the vector mask. You don't see the feathering shown in the thumbnail here. You just see it in the slider and in the result. But it's the same concept as moving that in a layer mask. So you can move either types of feather very easily with this slider. Which raises the question, what if you have both masks? So if I go and bring in a new mask here, let's click on this mask. I'm going to say layer mask, not feathered, click OK. I get both. And I get both because in my preferences, I have it set to keep independent layer and vector masks when possible. If this is unchecked, it would have simply replaced the mask of one type with the other. So in this case, if I go and adjust this feather, we're not seeing any change in the layer mask. And it is in fact the vector mask that is changing. We're seeing 829 is the vector mask. If I click on the layer mask and the vector mask both, even though I'm looking at the layer mask here, I'm seeing the vector mask in the panel. So the panel is going to be adjusting the vector mask if the vector mask is selected. If we unselect that, so now we just have the layer mask select, notice that the slider has changed. So now we can move the layer mask and you see it changing there. If we don't have either one selected, it jumps back to the vector mask. So basically, the only time you're going to adjust the layer mask is when it's selected and it's selected by itself. That's when you can adjust the layer mask. Otherwise, it's going to default to changing the vector mask, because most of the time when you have both of these, you're probably going to have a luminosity mask here and some sort of like hard selection here, and that's the one you want to feather. That's why it has that default. But by just clicking on the layer mask and making sure it's the only one selected, you can still adjust it here. So that's just a quick little tip on how that works. And that's the overall function of the precision and value sliders in Lumenzia.